And now, another informative video from the NASA archives.
But at any rate, the 4 engines continued to run a little longer than planned, and a little more taken out of the 3rd stage, but we still had fuel to continue the mission and leave Earth and head to the moon. Once again, we had a period of almost 2 days where things were very normal. In fact, we staged a TV show that by then this going to the moon was kind of a blasé to the major media, and they didn't even carry it. But it was just after this TV show that Jack Schweigert uttered that statement to Mission Control that Houston would have had a problem. We'd suffered this, what was called an explosion that actually was a electric short within an oxygen tank and a severe overpressurization in that whole cavity, and blew off a quarter of the spacecraft. That panel let go. So unfortunately, it was not a typical explosion of shrapnel flying around, or we would have been in big problem there, because the very thin wall behind where those tanks was the main propellant tanks for the command and service module, which were relatively smooth. The first thing on the agenda that Mission Control got to work figuring out, quote, now this alternate plan, was to get us back in a good direction to get home, because at the time we were not on a free return, which would normally allow you to loop around the moon and be roughly on the path to get back to an entry. And so the first thing they were scratching their heads about was to figure out the first maneuver that would put us on that path to go around the moon and get home. And I was obviously not involved, but I assume there's some discussion about was that the right thing to do. Or some people were arguing maybe a direct return, which would have used about all the propellant out of the service module. But at any rate, we got that maneuver done, and Jim Lovell asked me to look at consumables. We knew by then we had powered up the LEM. We had a good vehicle that normally, if fully powered up and flying the mission, would have lasted 2 days. So one thing was obviously we're going to have to do some stretching on power to get back. And I figured we could go to a power down of 18 amps. And I still have a card where I did this grocery store arithmetic and calculated that we could get back to the entry point, and then that was at 150-something hours. That we could make it on electric at 18 amps on its 30-volt system, but we ran out of water, which is water for cooling, I think about 5 hours before entry interface. But I'd had data in the system book from Apollo 11 where on that vehicle, when they left it in orbit, they turned off the water valve, and we watched the systems fail. And the first critical element failed at about 8 hours with no water cooling. So I figured we had some pad there, 3 hours at least. So anyway, we were in good shape. Now, it was interesting, sometime later, so I felt we'd get back to an entry point, but sometime later, years later, I went back in and reviewed some of the inner loops in Mission Control, and particularly in ECOM, which was the big action loop right after the calamity, and then later with the command module people. And it was interesting to hear the dialogue of them wrestling with the problems. We'll call it professional arguing through the troubleshooting initially for almost an hour, trying to save the second oxygen tank. We lost tank 2, and there was a slow leak had evolved in tank 1, and we never really knew quite why that was. But nevertheless, they went through troubleshooting, arguing to do what steps to take next to try to isolate the leak. And finally got to a point of where they run out of ideas. And it was obvious in their voices. I knew many of the people personally, some I recognized from the voices. They were just deflated. They were down because they knew they had lost the spacecraft. It was about that time that Glenn Lunny called them back to attention. He had replaced Gene Kranz, his team in Mission Control by that time, and told them we got to get the ship shut down. because we're starting to eat into the entry batteries, the batteries we would need to get through entry, small 344 amp hour batteries. So it came right back to attention, and now there was a little bit of a discussion in a similar way of how to shut this thing down, because the command and service module was the mothership. It was never supposed to be shut down in flight, no plan to shut it down in flight, and there was no book to shut it down in flight, the checklist. So they had to ad-lib during that time now how to shut this thing down, and it would have been easy to just pull the main bus tie breakers and you'd have killed it quickly, but they worried about harming systems, and they wanted them to be back, so they were already in their minds saying, we want it to be back in good shape when we power it back up for entry. So they certainly didn't feel we had lost everything at that time.